Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, first thing on the agenda, Happy Pride Month, everybody. Many people worry that this Pride Month may be a very tumultuous one, but I assure you, there have been many Pride Months in the past where things have looked bad. While it may not look like it now, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and there's gold at the end of our rainbow. That leads us into the perfect segue to the first section of the news. It is a very good thing coming from Japan. Japan court has ruled that a ban on same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. Now it's interesting because not long ago, Japan actually banned same-sex marriage, but surprise, surprise, Japan has now reneged on that position. Now, this court case isn't exactly all rainbows and unicorns, because the couple who brought this case up, the idea was that they were going to get the government to pay them 1 million yen in compensation due to unequal treatment that they faced because the government didn't legally recognize them as married, but that unfortunately did not end up happening. And this case can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and I don't necessarily know the breakdown of the Japanese Supreme Court, but if I had to take a wild guess based on the Japanese political scene, it might not be too good. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that this got to the point that it is now is interesting enough and could very much bode well for LGBTQ people in Japan. We'll have to wait and see. Hopefully things will turn out good for the LGBTQ population around the world. Speaking of around the world, this is another foreign news story that is going to cause a lot of issues, for me specifically, because, for those who don't know, Spain recently held some elections. This election did not bode well for the Spanish left. The main conservative opposition, the People's Party, had easily beaten Pedro Sanchez's Socialist Workers' Party. A hard-right party by the name of Vox got in a pretty close third. Then one of the biggest losses, one of the biggest shoot-downs, was many of the other left-wing parties did poorly, like the Republican Left of Catalonia and the Unidas Podemos coalition. Podemos/Unidas Podemos is the pretty hardline left-wing party. Now, that'd be bad enough as it was, but this was also supposed to coincide with elections that were going to be held later in the year. Spain was to hold parliamentary elections in December. So many people were wondering if this would bode well for Pedro Sanchez and the Socialist Workers' Party. But what ended up happening was Pedro Sanchez made the announcement that he would be moving up the elections to July, which confused everybody. For starters, Pedro Sanchez had repeatedly promised that he would not hold the elections earlier than December. Clearly, he changed his mind. But many people are trying to figure out, why? Why hold the elections this early? Because, after this big loss, people would think normally he would want to try and, make sure that he could spend a lot of time making sure that there's a campaign to make sure that he could win people's support by the end of the year. But he's just nope, after this big electoral loss for me, I'm just going to rush into the next election. This decision has changed Spanish politics so much so that one party technically just dissolved itself because they don't have any intentions in running in the upcoming elections. Since the elections just came by so fast, there was one party that literally just said, okay, we cannot form the right infrastructure to run candidacies, so we will have to wait to come back in the European Union elections, which essentially just made them dissolve themselves. People are trying to wrap their heads around, why he would do this. And it seems that there might be two sole reasons as to why he's doing this. To a degree, three. The first one is the rise of the Vox Party. It seems that he might be trying to do this to try and make sure that the Vox Party and the PP cannot formally form a coalition with each other, because after these elections, those two were in talks of forming a formal coalition or confidence and supply thing, so he might be trying to do that in order to subside that. But the bigger reason and the more obvious reason as to why he's doing this comes not from his right, but from his left. As I mentioned before, he actually has a sizable left wing to him. The Spanish Socialist Workers' Party is sort of a misnomer it's more of a social democratic party. And by more of, I mean it is. It's probably one of those ones that has like history within the socialist movement, which is why it gets its name. But, it's more of a social democratic type party. But there is sizable left-wing support among a party/coalition known as Podemos, which is a huge left-wing populist party that was formed by Pablo Iglesias, who in turn led the party from being somewhat fringe to being a very viable force within Spanish politics, to the point where the Socialist Workers' Party needed Podemos to form an actual coherent government. And as Podemos started becoming more mainstream, Pablo Iglesias wanted to take it to a larger setting. He wanted to run in his regional elections and hopefully become a big figure in there. But unfortunately, Podemos didn't do so well in those elections. So what ended up happening was Pablo Iglesias would end up resigning from the party and basically saying, it is time for me to pass the torch to a new generation, which left the left to try and figure out what the heck to do next. And two women ended up becoming sort of leaders within the Spanish left, Ione Belada and Yolanda Diaz. Yolanda Diaz would end up becoming the leader of the coalition Unida Podemos, but Ione would end up becoming the leader of the Podemos party. Yolanda would then end up becoming basically seen as the de facto successor to Pablo Iglesias. But the thing is, she did not want to become basically just his shadow. She didn't want to be Pablo Iglesias 2.0. So what she wanted to do was create a new, unified, thing of the Spanish left called Sumar, or Unite. And it would be the new joint, coalition with the Spanish left. But the problem was, while she could get a lot of the other members of the Unidas Podemos coalition to join with it, United Left, which is her own party, and a couple of others, unfortunately, Podemos was always sort of teetering on whether or not they would join in this new coalition. But these two were in talks into the formation of a coalition. And those talks were very close to happening and were slated to go on until the next elections. But now the elections are moved so quickly that Podemos and Sumar literally don't have any time to formally talk anymore. They have to decide pretty soon whether or not they can form a coalition. And as such, many people are trying to figure out okay, so I guess that what happens now? So it seems that Pedro Sanchez was trying to force the left to coalesce around him, and basically if the left over there is divided, then maybe he could try and siphon off whatever people are we can't decide between these two, so we'll just go with Pedro Sanchez. Basically trying to paint himself as I'm the left-wing option that has everything together. And this is where I'm going to have to pose a question. This one, it might be very tragic, but judging by how Pedro Sanchez has moved the elections upward, it's going to make it so that I have to, if I was going to talk about this one near the end of the year, when a month before the elections were slated to happen, in November, but unfortunately now that's not a thing, and that means that I'm going to have to choose which of these elections. I'm going to have to choose. I unfortunately will not be able to cover all the elections that I wanted to cover in this year. So I'm going to have to pose the question to my fans again. And while I'm at it, I'm going to put both election debacles that I plan on discussing. I only have 3 slots left for foreign elections this year, because there basically seems to be no important elections foreign that are going on in November or December, apparently. So really, I only have enough time for basically July, August, and September. Really weird that it's that late in the year, apparently. I have already decided what the one in September will be. I don't want to give it away right now, but it's going to be a good one, I think, hopefully, depending on how the situation pans out. But that leaves 2 remaining slots, but I have 4 elections that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Spain, New Zealand, and Slovakia. Those are the ones that I had scheduled, But now the Ecuadorian election has come up, so now I have 4 elections that I want to talk about, but only 2 slots left to fill. And you could say, well, then just give it to a different slot. But it's like, I want to give more video, like more variety, I guess. I don't want to do like 4 election, whatever. I could do that, but I don't necessarily think it'll give me enough time to research into certain ones. I'm going to take a wild guess which one will not win based on this result. But I'm basically just going to ask, which elections would you rather me talk about? Would you rather me talk about Ecuador and New Zealand, or Spain and New Zealand, or Ecuador and Slovakia, or Spain and Slovakia? I'm going to take a wild guess and say that nobody wants to hear me talk about the Slovakian elections, which is fair. That one was kind of like just slightly interesting. The other 3 are pretty interesting at the very least. I would say what I think is going to win, but then I might just make you guys want to pick that one just for the sake of like, you won. Or just pick a different one to spite me, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Whichever ones you want me to pick, you want me to do, I'll do them. Now, the last foreign news, something that has become foreign news. Remember Tara Reade, the woman who accused Joe Biden of sexual assault? Yeah, well, turns out Tara Reade has announced that she has defected to Russia. On Tuesday, it was revealed that she was at a press conference at Moscow with a registered foreign agent named Maria Butina, she was basically announcing that she was not only in Russia because she quote-unquote feared for her life, but that she was actively trying to get Russian citizenship, making claims that she received death threats for the accusations against Joe Biden, and is trying to make this big thing about she feels safe in Russia and whatever. Now, here's one of the big things that you may not have known, and I sadly knew about this a little bit, but apparently after Tara Reade, went through her accusations and became famous, she decided for no reason whatsoever, and a bunch of people decided to turn her into a political commentator for some reason. She had a show on the quote-unquote independent news network, or the independent left news network. I don't fucking know what they are. They're like, one of their co-hosts is a person with like a fucking chicken as their profile picture. She frequently collaborated with people like Caleb Maupin. And then somehow, all of a sudden, she was getting she was just being frequently allied with Russia, somehow becoming really close to some Russian foreign agents. This is one thing that I learned, when I read an article about this, and this is one thing I read in the article, and it basically explains, in 2022, there was a meeting in the United Nations where they were going to talk about, quote, weapons diversion, and for some reason, quote unquote, the Russian ambassador to the UN wanted to bring Tara Reade to talk about this. And she was rejected by India because India literally was like, what is her expertise in this field? To which she had none. But for some reason, they wanted to bring her there. It's oh my god, it's literally just so fucking stupid. I'm pretty sure I said this just on Twitter at one point, or in private or whatever. But she was just everybody was just treating her like she was this fucking saint. It was she had this news show on the fucking independent news network. She was getting all these people interviews and stuff, and she was getting she was being invited by the Russian ambassador to do things. It's and she and even with this, she was she posted this fucking video where she's literally trying to compare herself to fucking Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. It's ma'am, you are not Julian Assange. You are not Edward Snowden. I don't get it. I literally do not get it. And then it's she has the show. It's guys, I legitimately do not care about Tara Reade's political analysis. I don't care about Tara Reade thinking that she's not the next hero. She is not a hero. She and her friends and allies, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, have made a lot of accusations claiming that Joe Biden and the U.S. government is trying to harass her and whatever. And it's everybody's just no, literally no. And it's like, it's stupid because like she's thinking like, oh, the government is like doing a blah blah blah. And it's like, ma'am, you went to fucking Russia, the one where it's like if you blink wrong, they will kill you. And literally, it's just like, especially not caring about her analysis is the fact that go on her fucking Twitter feed or like her show feed, and her analysis is just completely all over the place. Literally on one day, she'll retweet a communist, and then the next day, she'll retweet a literal fascist. Because she has her ideology is literally just, I am anti-Joe Biden. That is her only ideology. Her only ideology is anti-Democrat, anti-Joe Biden. That is her only ideology. I don't care about your analysis. I don't care about you, Tara Reade. And then she just makes up things that are just flat out wrong, like where she says, like, oh, Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are the only members of Congress who are trying to investigate what happened. And it's like, no, literally a lot of people have openly talked about your accusations and have given you credibility on your accusations. AOC, Bernie, even Hakeem Jeffries has stated that he would be open to investigating your circumstances. But it is not only long since that happened, but also it is not 2020 anymore. This isn't important anymore. Man, when guys say women talking about sexual assault allegations makes them famous, this is what they must have meant. Because literally, she just said that she was like sexually assaulted by Joe Biden, and now magically she has a very popular online news show and is literally just going to be friends with a member of the Russian Duma, potentially getting fucking citizenship in the country of Russia. A fate worse than death. I wonder what's going to happen first. Is Tara Reade going to get arrested in Russia? Is she going to get killed by Putin? Or is she just going to lose all of her money and her passport and be stuck in Russia forever with no way of ever actually becoming like relevant again, and she's just gonna die as a homeless woman in Russia? I wonder what's gonna happen first. Now let's move on to the next story. The US bourgeoisie is really being showing as to why capitalism is bad. So it turns out 31 billionaires are worth more than the US Treasury. So as of the close of businesses on May 25th, the Treasury only had $38.8 billion in cash. And 31 billionaires are each worth more than the federal government's $38.8 billion in cash. Oh, so that was even worse. I thought it meant the 31 billionaires combined. Turns out no, they mean the 31 billionaires on their own. And yes, as I'm looking at it, yes, literally all of the 31 most prevalent billionaires have more money than the US Treasury. Weird that these 31 people individually have more money than the United States Treasury. Man, with all of that money, could you imagine what the United States could do? Like, I mean, with all that money, we literally could, I mean, just flat out, if we had a lot of that money, we could do so much. Like universal healthcare, fucking free college, Green New Deal. Like, we could literally do a ton of those things. And I know what you may be thinking, like, oh, but they're not all American billionaires. So what? We literally just need to take Elon Musk's money. We'll be able to pay for that tenfold. Speaking of things people have to pay, turns out the American bourgeoisie wants to try and cut the middleman again for the United States presidency. Now you might be saying, I thought they were already doing that with the buying of our two major presidential candidates. Then you might say, I thought they were already doing that with no labels. I thought they were already doing that with a lot of other things. But no, apparently the American, like 1% and rich Wall Street billionaires, they want to do it again. And it turns out the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, is floating the idea of potentially running for president, either as a Democrat or as an independent. The only reason that he's being listed as both is because originally Wall Street wanted him to run as an independent, but he says that that is basically not going to happen because running as an independent is a very bad idea, especially with the fact that Michael Bloomberg literally had to run as a Democrat in order to do that. Like, I will never forget just how fucking like blatant the Bloomberg candidacy was, but it turns out they want to do it again. Like, why does this keep happening? Like, for starters, I'm sick and tired of the freaking, like, centrist third party or, like, centrist independent nonsense, because it's just, like, you have, like, 2,000 options. You literally have 2,000 options. You just have to... There's some billionaires that literally they just know this. They just buy both politicians, and then they just hedge their bets on who wins. But then they don't even want to, like, do anything very big or blatant or important. But whatever. Like, it's just so ridiculous. Speaking of things that are ridiculous, the last news story. Turns out, YouTube has made a very stunning decision in regards to a certain thing. YouTube is going to be reversing a certain information policy. Now, if you remember, in the wake of the 2020 election, YouTube decided to crack down really hard on election disinformation, particularly electoral denialism that was going on. Like the people who were claiming that the 2020 election was rigged against Trump, or that it was flat out, not true, which is a good thing, because that kind of misinformation cannot be allowed to roam free on the internet. I'm not going to sit here and hear you go, but there's free speech suppression. I don't care. Misinformation, I don't care. Misinformation should be cracked down upon. Actual legitimate misinformation should be cracked down upon, if not having the, addendum. But unfortunately, the addendum doesn't even work anymore, because now the addendum is done by people who are dumb. I remember back in the 2020 election when, people were trying to post, election denialism on Twitter. Twitter would then post that, little thing, that little blurb on the bottom that's this is just verifiably untrue. Usually I would prefer that, and Twitter usually did that as well. During the, not Twitter, YouTube would do that as well. There were a couple of my videos that were coming out at the end of 2020 that vaguely aligned with elections, and then it turns out, YouTube was putting that little addendum, here's the actual information you need about the 2020 election, and it's this isn't even about the 2020 election, but whatever. But sometimes bad information is just so bad that it needs to be removed entirely. A lot of COVID misinformation just flat out had to be removed. But it turns out YouTube is going to be reneging on a lot of their current things about the 2020 election. Now, the reason why they're doing this is simply because they are trying to focus their attention on, trying to talk about the upcoming election and trying to build some, safeguards in regards to that. But it also might be, because they know that right-wing content gets more clicks, and that's the truth of the matter. Everybody likes to pretend conservatives are censored on social media, conservatives are censored on blank. They're not. Like I said, the only thing that is censored is flat-out misinformation and, harassment and hate crimes and stuff. It just so happens that the conservatives love doing those two things, and if conservatives stopped doing those two things, then maybe they wouldn't be censored and suppressed. But unfortunately, in order to be a conservative, you have to do those two things. This happens every time. Everybody points out, oh, but this prominent conservative was censored on Twitter for, calling down about the gender ideology. But it's their critique of the gender ideology is them finding some 13-year-old trans kid and then retweeting them saying, basically telling their audience, go threaten them and go try to kill them. And they go, but these prominent conservatives were criticizing Joe Biden's COVID policy, and as such, they needed to, talk about this. And their critiques of the Joe Biden COVID policy was them saying COVID is a satanic lie, and that instead you should be going around licking every doorknob that you see. Hopefully, safeguards are put in for the next election, because we cannot allow that kind of misinformation to be spread around again. With that out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video, an election that I've been waiting to talk about for a while, the Guatemalan election, but unfortunately, I was hoping to talk about it in a certain way, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk about it a different way, all because of one major event that has happened during the election. But before we get into that, we're going to have to go all the way back to explain why this election is important, what is the political history of this country for up to this point. Now, you know what now, of course, a lot of people know this by now, but usually when I do this, what usually ends up happening is I have to talk about for Latin American countries especially, I have to talk about long-standing history. But for more Western countries, I have to talk about basically more recent history. And the reason for that is usually because a lot of Latin American countries, they have a huge basis of their current political philosophy and political practices based on imperialism by the United States and whatever. Meanwhile, most Western democracies do not have that problem. This usually ends up leading to a lot of Latin American countries to have much richer and sort of actually interesting histories in regards to their politics. Unfortunately, that richness usually comes at the cost of many, many, many lives that the Western imperialists decide are not really worth it in the grand scheme of things. Guatemala being no exception. We're gonna have to start our story during the Great Depression. Guatemala's incumbent president, Lazaro Chazon, had a stroke and was forced to resign. This, combined with how the Great Depression hurt the economy of their biggest trade partner, the United States, meant that the country was in disarray. His supposed successor, General Mauro de Leon, reportedly resigned from the office before he was able to take the seat, so next in line, Baudilio Palma was appointed to take over. However, a mere 4 days later, another general of the military, Manuel Maria Orellano, came in, killed both of them, and took power for himself. But since the US had deep economic ties in Guatemala, they put a lot of pressure to have him resign, which he did 11 days later. A transitionary government was appointed by Congress until they could choose a formal president. However, due to all this turmoil, only one party would actually be able to field a candidate. Said candidate being a man by the name of Jorge Ubico Castañeda. Ubico is also known by the nickname of Central America's Napoleon, and this Central American Napoleon took a very interesting route. I mean, his name would suggest that, basically becoming a dictatorship. I say basically because there was some form of pretend democracy, but for the most part, he literally was just a dictator. For his first big agenda was enforcing a massive anti-corruption bill, put a pin in that for later, maintaining close economic ties to the US, and most importantly, the United Fruit Company, who very much grew and had a lot of their fruit made in Guatemala. But the biggest thing that he would end up being known for is jailing/executing prominent political dissidents. Not even people who had major problems with his ideology or whatever, but people who just had a problem with him himself and things that he technically broke in his corruption bill. One prominent example came from many people criticizing him getting a $200,000 gift from Congress. In fact, 90 people critiqued him. All 90 of them would end up going to jail. But the biggest thing that showed his distaste for people who criticized him came from one very prevalent story that was spread around during his administration. In early 1934, Ubico made an announcement that instead of holding another election, he would instead hold a referendum to extend his term. There were a lot of people within his own circle who even protested against this. One person being a property registration director named Efrain Aguilar Fuentes, publicly announcing that not only did he disapprove of this, but if this referendum were to happen, he would not back Ubico, or even if there were an election, he just wouldn't back him, basically saying that he broke his ties with Ubico. Then Ubico was a bit mad, so he invited him to the palace, to the presidential palace, and asked him, why would you do this? Why would you not even want to back me? And was like, what's going on? And Fuentes said that he knew that one of Ubico's advisors, a police chief by the name of Rodrigo Anzueto Valencia, had embezzled 28 properties, and Fuentes was like, I can't support a person who does this. However, unbeknownst to Fuentes, Ubico was actually telling Valencia to do this on his behalf. So what Fuentes had done was basically say, I can't support someone in your administration for doing something corrupt, but in actuality, he said, I can't support you for doing something corrupt, because he was the one doing it. And almost immediately afterwards, Ubico announced that Fuentes and 4 other people who were actually trying to push for Valencia to run for president against Ubico, he announced that all 5 of them had been arrested for attempting to commit a coup against him, and then he would later execute all 5 of them, and then use this story as like, this is proof that I need to remain in power because people are trying to stop me, so I should remain in power and I should be the one who is in charge forever. And people who would point this out to the population would also face some repercussions. The guy who published this story in his journal would end up going to jail too. So now people realized, oh crap, we're literally in a dictatorship. So in June of 1944, a general strike was held, and in October of that year, many military officials began fighting to depose Ubico. So Ubico finally resigned in December of 1944, and Guatemala held its first free and fair elections in its entire history up to that point. The winner of said elections was a man by the name of Juan Jose Arevalo, and he pushed for an ideology that he called spiritual socialism, which was not so much an economic philosophy, but rather a philosophy in liberation, pushing for a new constitution that made land redistribution, a minimum wage hike, and helping unions top priority. But unfortunately, due to him not being as radical, but also with major opposition by right-wingers, he kind of faced a lot of challenges. But even though he wasn't as radical as many other people, and he wasn't able to do as much as he wanted to, the world still saw him as this extreme far-left radical, and he had 25 coup attempts against him. But none of them succeeded, and it seems this just helped him popularity-wise. And to show how good of a guy he really was, he even decided to do symbolic things to show that he was different from former presidents of Guatemala, such as not running for a second term. And due to the fact that he was such a stark contrast from what the Guatemalan people had known about politicians up to that point, they basically decided to keep his party around, and his successor would be another member of his party, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was a little bit different than Arevalo, as he was a touch more radical and was not going to be held back by certain things that held Arevalo back. And one of his biggest pieces of legislation was a law by the name of Decree 900, which would take any land larger than 224 acres and give it to the poor, taking land from 1,700 and giving it to 50,000, which is 1/6 of Guatemalan's population at the time. And unfortunately, we've all heard some of this stuff before. Left-wing populist leader elected in a Latin American country and does really, really good things for the people. That only means one thing. The United States got mad. However, believe it or not, it wasn't the government that got mad at first. It was actually the United Fruit Company. Because due to this law, 15% of the land that the United Fruit Company owned would be taken and redistributed to poor people. Now, this wasn't the only thing, because, as you know, sometimes there are these things called strikes and labor disputes. And what usually happened up to that point is whenever there were these kinds of things before, the president would side with the UFC. However, since they now have a left-wing president, Arbenz would choose the workers over them. So the UFC decided to go to Eisenhower and lobby to have him depose of Arbenz in a coup, claiming that communism was growing in Guatemala and that soon he might try to work with the USSR and they could either take the resources completely from them or, in worst case scenario, weapons could be sent there. So from June 18th to the 27th of 1954, the United States initiated a coup to overthrow Arbenz, and as the story goes, leftists were purged, persecuted, and the country was under military rule until 1966. And if you know something else, you may know that this is sort of where we get the term banana republic from, because it means a country that is incredibly unstable and is usually just a stepping stool for like a foreign nation's like capital. The only thing that kept Guatemala like together was simply their export of bananas and its relatively close relationship with the United States due to this. And nowhere was that more evident with this coup government. Like, the first election that this coup government held after the coup was mired in so much corruption and so much instability that immediately after it was held, they had to annul it because like there was no way that this result happened. But it seemed like this one would sort of be shorter because it seemed like soon afterwards things were getting back on track. And in fact, Arevalo actually contemplated coming back to Guatemala and running for that second term that he never claimed. And what was interesting is that the incumbent president, Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes, actually stated he might be allowed to do so. However, Ydigoras would then soon become a victim of a coup himself. I would go over all the change of powers, but functionally there was no difference for it for a long time. Even when a civilian president was elected, he just governed just like one of the military junta-like leaders. And the biggest example of this came from the Guatemalan Civil War, where the government cracked down on leftists and indigenous people, harshing it to the point that they had to fight back. One particular era being so bad, it is now known as the Silent Holocaust, where 166,000 Mayans were massacred and 900,000 were displaced by the Guatemalan government. It wasn't until the 1990s where, at the behest of the US, Guatemala started shifting back to some form of democracy, but still within that neoliberal framework. It wasn't until 2007 where they got a brief taste of something different, with the election of a man by the name of Alvaro Colom. He was a center-left social democrat, expressing solidarity with the Mayan people and expanding social programs, but I don't know if it was just his ideology or if he was afraid of possible retribution from the United States, but he never went that extra step, an example of which being in regards to the death penalty, claiming that he opposed the death penalty with a burning passion, fearing that there would be retribution from God if it happened, if they continued the death penalty. But then, he never ended up doing anything to stop the death penalty, and soon Alvaro Colom would then leave office with a 95.83% disapproval rating, which made whatever remained of the Guatemalan Social Democratic left to think, maybe the problem was that he was too left-wing, and they started shifting a bit rightward, and what happened is the country just then shifted back rightward, going back to having hard right presidents. But there's essentially nothing interesting going on with how the current administrations are. It was basically just right-wing, neoliberal type governance. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the election itself. The election is slated to be held on June 25th, 2023, and this election is quite packed, as the number of candidates in the race is 22. But of course, if you look at the thumbnail, there are not 22 people on the thumbnail, and unfortunately, not all these people are worth discussing. So basically, there are 4 categories of candidates in this election. First, we have the bottom 4, which are essentially complete nobodies. These are people, they don't have any prominent history within Guatemalan politics. They don't have a history, their parties aren't that prevalent. Basically, these guys are complete nobodies. They're basically going to be the bottom 4 candidates. Again, complete utter nobodies. Next, we have 9 people who are considered somebody, but they're not really going to be that well known in the election. Either their party is relatively small or they're not really that prevalent of a political figure, but either way, they're just not really going to be going anywhere for the election. they'll definitely have their small niche group of small supporters, but they won't be able to go that far. Let me use one of them as an example. Amílcar Rivera of the party Victoria. In the last presidential election, he got a grand total of 2.54% of the vote. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that he's probably going to get relatively the same amount of votes, or he's going to be in relatively the same place, which is really near the bottom, especially with people who are probably going to be a lot more aligned with some of the larger options. But there are also 4 candidates that are representative of having a decent amount of support. Like, they're parties that they're not going to be that big, but they are going to have like a decent number of support, probably around like 5 or 4%. You know, like it's hard to really describe like how much percentage, because it's even with that last election, it was like they had less candidates in that election, but the support was like divided very like more noticeable. Maybe it'll be a little bit different this time around. Maybe it'll be a lot less notable. But like these are parties that are relatively important to Guatemalan politics. Although I think I probably wouldn't talk about some of these guys if certain things happened, but we'll get to that in a second. And lastly, we have 5 candidates that are considered the frontrunners. For the sake of keeping things relatively brief, we'll only be talking about the ones that are somewhat prominent, either due to who they are politically or what the party they are representing. First, on the way bottom, we have a guy by the name of Rafael Espada, the former vice president to Alvaro Colom, and a really famous heart surgeon within the country. He is running under a party known as the Republican Party, a center-right party that is focused on fighting corruption. Not really that much to say about him. I really only included him because he was the vice president, so it's like he definitely has a lot more importance than some of these other guys. Like you might say, but what about some of these other somebody candidates? Aren't they relatively important? Well, let me explain what I mean by another somebody candidate. Like the guy, Amílcar Rivera of Victoria, he was a mayor of a city. Really not that important. Okay, so the next person that I'll mention is Amílcar Pop. He is a member of the Central American Parliament. He is running under a coalition of 2 of the most prominent leftist parties in Guatemala. The first one is WINAC, an indigenous leftist party of the Quiche people. And the next one is the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity, a former guerrilla army that turned into a political party. These guys have sort of been representative of the indigenous-led left wing of the country. It's a position that they held until very recently, but they're going to probably be able to reclaim it to a degree thanks to certain events that we'll get into in a second. Next is Isaac Farchi, a former member of Congress and the 6th place finisher in the last election. He is running as the candidate of the Blue Party, a center-right party claiming to fight for the rights of the Garifuna people. Next is Bernardo Arevalo, a member of Congress and son of former President Juan Jose Arevalo. He is running under the Movimiento Semilla, the Seed movement. This is what's regarded as sort of the mainstream socialist party, I guess. Basically, the furthest left party of the lighter-skinned upper class in the country, sort of continuing under like the established forms of leftism. Meanwhile, they're like basically the main, like not really opponent, but more like the main focus outside of like basically they're the ones that like if you don't want to be in the like extreme social democratic parties of the quote unquote left, or if you are not part of like the far indigenous left, this is basically what you call home. Those are the 4 that are considered somebody that could have a decent part to play in the election. But these 5 are the candidates that most of the Guatemalan media has essentially focused their attention on. First is Manuel Conde, congressman and candidate for president in 2003 and 2007, running under the political party Vamos, which is the ruling conservative party of Guatemala. Next, we have Manuel Villacorta, former ambassador to Israel and 7th place finisher in the last election. He is running under the party Will, Opportunity, and Solidarity, which is a social democratic party formed from dissidents of WINAC and the mainstream social democratic party of Guatemala. Basically, like, people from both of those ones tried to come together to form the new party that would be in between them. But this party is placed further right than Samia, but further left than the mainstream Social Democrats. You might be wondering, wait, then what party did he run under in the last cycle? He ran under WINAC, which is weird to a degree, but it's maybe he seemed to be of the right wing of WINAC, or WINAC just endorsed him because they wanted a candidate on the ballot. Whatever happened, he basically is a candidate of, basically, if you don't veer too far away from social democratic style politics, but don't want to, support the mainstream social democratic party. The next candidate is Edmund Millett, former member of Congress and 3rd place finisher in the last cycle. He is running under a political party known as Cabal, a party that split off from the center-right Humanist Party after they supported the incumbent right-wing government, so they are more of the center and center-right. Now, Millett is actually interesting because we actually do have some pieces of his platform. You see, because some of the places where you can find their actual platform is a little hard to find, and he is one of the ones that you make it apparent, you can see his platform. His platform includes raising police salaries, allowing the army to take over policing duties, cutting state bureaucracy, and forming a new anti-corruption mechanism with worldwide backing. So basically, still maintaining that sort of neoliberal center-right order. Okay, so the next candidate is probably one of the most interesting candidates in the race. You will see why that is in a second. Okay, so the candidate in question is named Sandra Torres, the ex-wife of Alvaro Colom and 2-time presidential candidate, making the runoff in both times. She is running under her husband's party, the National Unity of Hope. This is the mainstream Social Democratic Party that I have been talking about for a while. So mainstream that it even has a right-wing shift in recent years. Now, you may see this a little bit before, I talked about Alvaro Colom, and he's the death penalty. He was afraid that people doing the death penalty would face retribution from God. So the party was indeed, and still is, very religious, being very heavily part of the Christian left. However, in the most recent election, Torres started adding a lot of socially conservative planks to appeal to the right wing, such as opposing abortion and opposing same-sex marriage. Now, Torres and Colom actually have a very interesting sort of dynamic that might sound very familiar if you I'm gonna say their dynamic, and then you tell me if it sounds a little bit familiar. They're two people well known in sort of their country's center-left liberal type area. One is seen as being a very, in retrospect, not that prominent and not that well-liked president, and the other used that sort of relationship to kickstart their own political career and become a 2-time failure for the presidency, having a decent number of marital problems, which would end up leading to the woman becoming immensely more unpopular than the person that actually was marred and had a very prevalent career in the presidency. If only there were two people in the United States that had basically that same relationship that I could then use to explain this to an American-centric audience. I guess we'll never know. It wasn't known at first, but it has become very apparent in retrospect how completely suspect this whole fucking thing was. Let me explain their relationship. So, Sandra Torres and Alvaro Colom would marry in June of 2002. Not that long afterwards would be when Alvaro Colom forms the National Unity of Hope and would then become their general secretary and then their presidential candidate. The couple would remain together until right before Alvaro Colom has to leave the presidency. Right in 2011, they divorce. Sandra Torres then makes the announcement that she intends to run for president of Guatemala. Now, why is this important? It's because in Guatemala, it is forbidden for people who are relatives of the current president to then run for president as well. Very interesting that she decides to leave Alvaro Colom right before she has the ability to run for president herself. And even the Guatemalan Supreme Court acknowledged how, obvious this was, so they refused to let her run for president in that election, and she had to run in the next 2 elections. It is very apparent that Sandra Torres literally just used him for fucking political clout. And it's kind of depressing, especially considering in the aftermath, because not that long ago, Alvaro Colom sadly passed away due to esophageal cancer. And the day he died, basically the entire Twitter feed of people were talking about how Sandra Torres must be ecstatic because of how blatantly she fucking used him. But the last major candidate is probably the scariest. Zuri Rios, the daughter of brief Guatemalan dictator Efrain Rios Montt. Now, you might say, wait, brief Guatemalan dictator? Why didn't you mention him? Literally, he was the president of Guatemala for 17 months. Basically, 1982 to 1983. He would then himself become a victim of a coup himself in 1983. But after he was forced out of office, he then became the face of the Guatemalan hard right for the rest of his life. But what is interesting about those years is, notice how I said that he was president from 1982 to 1983? Yeah, well, you want to know what else happened from 1982 to 1983? The Silent Holocaust. Yeah. He made himself very well known in those 17 months. So much so that he was sentenced to 80 years due to his crimes against humanity. Also, random tidbit about Zuri. She was apparently at one point married to a US congressman by the name of Jerry Weller. And this actually led to him being in the hot water because they're like, you're married to the fucking, daughter of a dictator. Are you kidding me? It is a shame that we live in freaking crazy world. Okay, so, she's actually running under a 2-party coalition. First, the Unionist Party, a far-right party that was usually relegated to the fringe in politics, but of course she is now running with that party. I wonder if this is a very bad sign. And Valor, a rebrand of the party that her father ran, so a far-right political party. She really only has 2 prevalent pieces of her platform. First, taking a very hardline stance on abortion, being against it. But the second one, which is again very troubling, is the fact that she wants to mimic Nayib Bukele's security policy. You know, the thing that makes Nayib Bukele a literal dictator. I wonder if we should be sounding the alarm on this, and if people on the left worldwide should have been talking about this race and potential candidates that could have been good to counteract her. If only people who were not me were doing that. But I guess that's just a thing that's just a little too hopeful, apparently. Now, events of the campaign, there really hasn't been that much that is considered a very big, relevant stuff about the campaign. Really, the biggest things come from the frequent attacks and trying to remove candidates from the ballot. You see, first, there have been many candidates that many people have been trying to get removed from the ballot, and others who have been successfully removed from the ballot. Now, first, for the people who were attempted to get removed and failed, Sandra Torres was challenged for her place on the ballot because her vice presidential nominee was a pastor before becoming part of her ticket. And in Guatemala, that is forbidden. So basically, they say, if you are a member of a clergy, you cannot enter politics. Weird that their separation of church and state seems to be more stringent than ours. Next, we have the idea that Movimiento Semilla was almost banned because of alleged forgery. Manuel Villacorta was almost banned because of allegedly falsifying signatures. But the biggest attempt, and the one that everybody was hoping would happen, was attempting to get Zuri Rios banned from the election due to her father being the perpetrator of a silent Holocaust. But unfortunately, all of those people managed to remain on the ballot. However, there were a couple of candidates who were not so lucky. The first one was a really smaller candidate by the name of Oscar Rodolfo Castianda, who was banned because of an error. Another candidate that was banned was named Roberto Arzu, the son of a former President Alvaro Arzu, and was the 5th place finisher last time, who was banned because allegedly he had started campaigning too early, because in a lot of Latin American countries they have the pre-candidacy status and then they have the official candidacy status. And apparently, I guess he was campaigning before even the pre-candidacy status was established, and he didn't pay a $50,000 fine. The most recent candidate to be banned is a man by the name of Carlos Pineda, who was regarded as one of the frontrunners for a while. He's a businessman who basically tried to mimic an Andrew Yang or a Rodolfo Hernandez. That's the guy from Colombia. He was banned for, quote, failing to collect signatures from party delegates and filing required financial reports. But if you're a fan of this show, you know the biggest piece of bullcrap this cycle. The biggest candidate that was banned from the election. If you don't know, then you might be wondering, wait, how could a frontrunner being banned not be as big as this one? That's because this banning is such obvious BS, and this candidate was a very prominent frontrunner as well. The candidate in question is a woman by the name of Thelma Cabrera. Thelma Cabrera was an indigenous rights activist and 2019 presidential candidate, getting 4th place in the cycle. She was, and still is, a member of the Movement for the Liberation of Peoples, a far-left socialist of the 21st century indigenous left-wing populist party, a party that would sound very much like the likes of MAS in Bolivia, which is why a lot of people in the media were claiming that she would be Guatemala's Evo Morales. Very early on, she was also regarded as a potential frontrunner in this election, but she was one of the earliest and most prominent candidates to be facing this problem with the electoral system, and they've stated that the reason why that she is not allowed to run in this upcoming election is because her vice presidential candidate by the name of Jordan Rodas is facing allegations and investigations that need to be resolved. But Rodas has denied at being under any investigation whatsoever. The real reason why she is not being allowed to run for president is because her party is very critical of the Guatemalan government and very critical of all of the parties within Guatemala, even the ones of the left. And despite that, she was very much poised to potentially win this cycle. I 100% maintain that if Thelma Cabrera was in this cycle and she was able to run, she had a very good chance of winning. Let me explain. During the last cycle, throughout the entire polling process, Thelma Cabrera was not really poised to do that well. Here is the polling of the last cycle. Here was the polling up in that cycle. 3.22%, 5%, 5.5, 7.6. Basically relatively small. She was basically poised to be 5th place, a pretty distant 5th place. And if you looked at her party and her, you would understand why you might be skeptical of her doing really well initially. Not only does she come from a part of the Guatemalan political scene that is regarded as fringe, not only due to their left-wing leanings, but due to the fact they represent the indigenous population, but she also separates herself from the pre-existing parties of this ilk because she says that they have become too mainstream and too, like, not like too corporate. Like, they don't represent they don't represent indigenous people as well as she says that they should. So she, like, separates herself from that and has become, like, a more technically more fringe and more far left than them, the parties that were originally regarded as the Guatemalan far left. So you could understand why people might underestimate her. But then when election day came, she got 10.37% of the votes, which put her in 4th place, and not just 4th place, a close 4th place, beating Roberto Arzu by 4 points, and being 1 point away from being 3rd, and 3 points away from making it to the runoff. Why did she do so hot? Very obviously, they were overpolling areas that didn't have a big indigenous population. But when they actually had the indigenous people turn out to vote, they naturally pushed her over the edge. And if you looked at the polls that were being conducted in this cycle before Cabrera was kicked off the ballot, you'll notice that Cabrera was polling around the levels that she got in the last cycle. You know, starting off 5.6, 5, 8, 5.2, 11, 14, 9.2, 6, 7.1, 5, 8.8, 11.3, 10.5, 7. Like, around that level that she got the last cycle. In fact, 5 of those polls had her beating the likes of Torres. Remember, Torres, is supposed to be the candidate of the, like, mainstream left, and Cabrera is supposed to represent the candidacy of the fringe left. And now you see that the fringe ain't looking so fringe no more. So I legitimately believe that she had more of a chance than even the Guatemalan media was trying to let on. And they couldn't do any sort of suppression, so the only thing they could do is literally just point blank making it so that she can't be on the ballot. All of these debacles and many other things have led to 7 of the candidates in this election decrying that this election will be mired by a lot of electoral fraud. Amílcar Rivera, Bernardo Arevalo, Manuel Villacorta, Amílcar Pop, Roberto Arzu, Carlos Pineda, and Thelma Cabrera. The latter 3, Arzu, Pineda, and Cabrera, even point blank calling on the presidential election to be boycotted and for people, like for their supporters, to vote blank in the presidential election. Although Cabrera, of course, is trying to help other candidates on the ballot. Like, she's saying, like, explicitly vote blank for the presidency and vote good for our candidates down the ballot. Now, polling is where things are going to get interesting. You see, with all the candidates being disqualified and such, there's a huge issue in regards to polls, as everybody basically has to reshuffle who they support every single time a candidate is kicked off or put back on the ballot. There were some polls that will literally be conducted in certain eras, literally just saying, like, hey, if this candidate gets off the ballot, who would you support instead? And also, this one, they've essentially just started focusing purely on the top 5. So, just for the sake of everybody here understanding, let's just go over the top 5 and see how each of them do well with polling. First, we'll start off with Villacorta, who has sadly not been doing the best with polling. The polls that have been conducted after certain things were finalized show this: 3.9, 3.1, 4, 4.1, 2, 2, 1.5. So as you can see, Villacorta is trending downwards. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that many people of his ilk might be gravitating towards the likes of Torres, or maybe they're going to the WNAC candidacy, or maybe they're going to Arevalo. I don't know. It seems that they're just going to be going over to other candidacies. Or maybe they're seeing what's happening with Cabrera and just being like, this is kind of stupid. Manuel Conde has faced similar issues. 3.2, 4.5, 5, 4.6, 3.4, 3.4, 3.8, 2.3, 4, 4, 2.9. that number is also somewhat trending downwards, with some spikes but mostly going down. Similarly, it seems like the people who just wanted to continue the presidency as it was have kind of started gravitating towards more right-wing options that would probably have a better chance of winning. Now, the next candidate that has been doing okay is Mulet. Mulet has, basically, Mulet, Pineda, Rios, and Torres were the ones that were usually regarded as, these are the ones that were most likely to make it to the runoff. But Pineda, sadly, he ain't going to be making the runoff anytime soon. But the other three are basically the ones that are sort of poised to potentially make it to the runoff. Mulet, originally polling at very early on as making it to the runoff and being the highest polling candidate, 14.1, followed by 19, 10.1, 11.5, 11.1, 17.5, 13.5, 16.3, 21, 14, 8, 14.6. And of those ones, 4 of them show him making it to the runoff. Unfortunately, none of those are the most recent ones, but the problem is, the most recent polling did have Pineda in it. So it's let's briefly look over Pineda's political party, just so we can understand. It's a center-right, conservative, liberal, decentralized populist party, so maybe that might actually bode well for Mulet. Sandra Torres was sort of always seen as she's guaranteed the runoff, basically because there's no one else in her field that really can siphon away votes from her. But let's look at some of the polling. 6.9, 17.4, 17.5, 16.5, 18.4, 5.2, 17.4, 23, 20, 20, 17.9. Now, of those polls, we have 7 where she makes it to the runoff, and 4 where she flat out wins. But as you can see, as the election goes on, the numbers seem to be doing well for her. Again, similarly seeming to be that lefter options are being removed from the ballot or they're being scared into voting for Torres because, hey, she's at least better than Rios. Speaking of, she has sort of, many people have been regarding her as, almost guaranteed the runoff. But if you look at the actual polling numbers, things are a little bit more complicated than that. 13.5, 22, 19.2, 13.5, 14.3, 9.2, 8.6, 19.6, 19, 16, 10, and 22.9. Now, 22.9 has her flat out winning in the last poll. She makes it to the runoff in 7 of the polls, and she wins 3 of them. And one of them is very recent. But again, that is a poll with Pineda in it. You can see, the numbers keep fluctuating, but I think a majority of people do seem to understand that it seems like she and Torres, if I had to place bets on it, I would say that her and Torres are the most likely runoff. And they've currently yet to do any second round polling, but let's take a look at a little bit about these other, because there are actually some other polls that are very interesting. You see, these polls basically show things that are similar, but might not be as relevant, I guess. So basically, here is the ones. The first one is called Perception of Triumph. Basically, who people think are the most likely to win the election. And both of these polls have Rios winning. But again, these are polls with Pineda in it. So I don't know. Next is the candidate of the most positive opinion. The candidate that they have the most good opinion on. And unfortunately, Rios is winning. And not only did they do ones on who do you like the most of these candidates, they said who do you hate the most of all these candidates. And sadly, Torres won that poll. So it seems that if it is a Torres v. Rios runoff, then Torres might not do so hot. And to be fair, that is kind of obvious considering the fact that she has not one, but 2 chances to beat a right-wing opposition candidate, and neither time was successful. Conclusions/support section. Ideally, I wanted to support Cabrera. I literally was like on my way to being like 100% supporting Cabrera. Go to my website, and there she is, Cabrera. But since she's not an option, I think the left is kind of screwed in this election. Amilcar Pop and Bernardo Arevalo are good candidates, but they are nowhere close to making it into the top of the field, and the candidates that are technically left that are in the top of the field are kind of trash. And out of principle, I have chosen to keep Cabrera on my website, even though she is not going to even remotely be able to get back on the ballot. Like, it's over. She's not going back on the ballot, and she's off of it, and she doesn't have a chance anymore. So, but I'm keeping her on just out of principle, and also because, whatever. Like, yeah. If you happen to be a Guatemalan in my audience, by all means, I think best course of action is Amilcar Pop or Bernardo Arevalo. Whatever you do in the next round is up to you. Now, you may say, given some things that I said in the last episode, that you might think that I would be enthusiastically backing Torres in the next round. But no. Torres, she's... like, when you don't even have those social issues, it's like, it gets a little harder. Best case scenario, somehow Thelma Cabrera gets a ton of write-in votes, and then she wins the first round outright. So anyways, thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you want to see more content from me, you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.